So, now that we're winding things down, I wanted to do what I've always promised that I would, or at least said that I wanted to do, and get some of the Patreon exclusive videos out into the general population. It's not like I think they were ever being watched at all over on Patreon, at least I never had a single comment on any of them, but now that I've shut down my Patreon completely, I'm going to just be repurposing them, 10 at a time, into supercuts. I can't guarantee that they're all going to show up here, but I'm going to try, at least for the majority. These are all going to be in their original form as my patrons actually saw them. So let's get started. Do you like answering questions from the religious? We know what a scam it all is, but do you let them lead you down the primrose path, or do you stick it to them the first second that you get? I'll show you why the second option is the correct one as we evaluate a question for atheists. Kick these people where it hurts, because it's the only thing that actually works. Here comes a short from Armand Scipione. I probably didn't pronounce that right, but whatever. He's got a question for atheists, and it's a question that we've all heard a million times before, but we'll rip it apart once again. There are lots of options for how to answer, and most of them will completely derail their scripts. Never go along with their scripts. Show just how irrational it all is, because that's actually kind of fun.
This is a question that I always like to ask atheists.
And I love answering questions, so that's convenient. Of course, the religious, they don't really want atheists to answer, or at the very least, they don't care what we say, because they're not after a better understanding of the atheist mindset. They're really just trying to use these questions to seem like they care, while it's really aimed at the already religious in their audience. That's why all of these questions are so blatantly framed as gotchas. But I'll be fair because I haven't seen his question yet, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. What do you have for us today, Armand? Because I'd really like to answer.
Do you believe all modern science that said the universe has a beginning?
Well, first off, it doesn't. Now I'll get there in a second. We can already see where he's going with this, though. It's just a variation on the cosmological argument, and that's painfully easy to demolish, so let's do that right now. Modern cosmology does not say that the universe had a beginning. Our particular instantiation of space-time? Maybe. What we look around and interpret as the universe, we think that this particular configuration, that started at the moment of the Big Bang. That doesn't mean that it really began, though. It just changed form. The Big Bang came from a state of intense heat and density, meaning something preceded it. We don't know what that was, but something had to have been there before our particular instantiation came along. So in the sense that I had a beginning when my body started to grow, I also came from pre-existing stuff, and I really just changed form. And so too did the universe. This guy doesn't actually know cosmology. He's just repeating the standard apologist nonsense that he's heard from other people. So let's just trash it all, because that's all it really is. Trash.
Because even atheist scientists like Stephen Hawking will say, okay, yes, the universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago.
What we currently identify as our instantiation of space-time, yes, sure, why not? And I came into existence 58 and some odd years ago. So what? What we identify as a thing doesn't mean that thing truly began, except conceptually. That doesn't make it a real beginning. It just makes it easier for us as humans to think about. Now, if you start saying this to the apologists, they tend to freak out because you're not doing what they expect you to do. They expect you to be just as dumb as they are, and the second you're not, or you say something that they don't expect, they tend to run away. Why? Because this is just a scam, nothing more. It's not a serious question for atheists. You'd think that they'd be asking this to cosmologists, right? They don't, because they're just dumb and afraid to be shown to be the mental midgets that they actually are. So no, I can see right through what you're trying to do. I do not claim that the universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago. Things are in a constant state of changing form. I'd expect to see his jaw hit the floor at that.
So if it came into being, logic tells us that anything that began to exist had to have a cause.
But as I already said, it didn't begin to exist. Now he's just doing kalam, and as we already know, kalam is completely worthless. It just says, has a cause. It doesn't say that cause was a god. I have a cause, my parents fucked. Then biology took over, no gods required. So he's not going to get anywhere with any credible atheist this way, which is why he's not really asking atheists at all. He's saying this to other theists who are just going to nod their heads because it fits in with their theology. He doesn't care what atheists have to say, and I doubt he's ever posed this question to a single actual atheist in his life. He's just asking for trouble, which is what he desperately wants to avoid.
And therefore the universe began to exist. Therefore the universe had to have a cause that was outside of it.
Which doesn't make it a god, does it? Notice he's just assuming that his phantom atheist is going to answer yes to his first proposition, right? This whole thing falls apart if he doesn't. It's almost like this is a script, right? Never let them run their scripts. It really drives them crazy, and it makes them look like the idiots they actually are if you don't. Everything he said so far has been wrong. But so long as you stick it on YouTube where nobody can directly answer and make him look bad, he's fine, right? Because that's how all of this stuff works. It's absolutely pathetic.
So spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and extremely powerful.
Nope, none of that applies. You're assuming that our space and our time are the only space and time that could ever possibly exist, right? That just shows that he doesn't understand cosmology. What if there was another universe before ours, and the death of that universe gave rise to our own? There goes spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, right? I might give you extremely powerful, but that's not what you're actually looking for. He's going for his imaginary friend, and a purely natural cause doesn't get him there, does it? That's, again, why he doesn't really want to talk to atheists. His audience are the idiots in the pews that already believe what he does and are willing to hand over their money if they're entertained. Do not play into their hands if you ever run into one of them brave enough to try this for real. Mostly you won't, because it's painfully simple to reveal them to be the dishonest imbeciles that they are. Give it a shot though, because it's kind of fun.
In other words, that's what we describe as God.
No, it's not. Shut them down right then and there, because they are not describing their God at all. If they believed only in some vague, ill-defined force that was spaceless and timeless, and those are irrational things, since without space and time, nothing can exist and nothing can act. But if that was what they were talking about, then there would be no need for a church, would there? God would have no intentionality, no intelligence, no will, no desires, and certainly no reason or desire to be worshipped. So, no, you're not talking about your God. This is just an end run around reality. This is something that William Lane Craig tries all the time with his stupid Kalam stuff, and it doesn't work for him either. A lot of the other apologists have just picked up the ball, and they're trying to run downfield with it, but don't let them get away with it either. They are not describing their God. What is in the Bible is not just some spaceless, timeless something. You can't get from A to B. In fact, ask them how they do that. Even if you accept that something spaceless and timeless, etc., whatever, created the universe, how does that point to their specific God? Watch them lose it, because that's exactly what will happen, because they can't bridge the divide. Hell, play with them. It's fun. Say that it was some other god. Lots of them are described that way. Well, thank you for proving that the Sikh god Waheguru, who is described as shapeless, timeless, and sightless, thank you for proving it's real. Or the Baha'i God, who is described as a personal God, unknowable, inaccessible, the source of all revelation, eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, and almighty. Watch their eyes pop out of their heads. Because these people are not being honest. They are not honest interlocutors. They're just scam artists. It's time we stop pretending to be nice to them and call them out on their ridiculous bullshit. Because that's all it is, and it's all it's ever been. The religious really are gullible, aren't they? At least a good portion of them are, which is why they tend to fall for endless scams, and today is no exception. Let's look back at some past scams that the religious embraced, hook, line, and sinker. These people are pathetically stupid, and that's really not much of a surprise. As I keep saying, you have to pay attention to the words that the religious use, because it usually proves they have no clue what the hell they're doing. That's not to say all usages of improper English are a warning sign, but the fact that they can't put these words together in a coherent way shows that something bad is going on, that something stupid is likely incoming. So here comes a TikTok video called "Another Evidence That Heaven is Real." And that's not how words work. So let's get to it.
You tell me what you remember about heaven, okay?
Oh good, Colton Burpo. Now, that's just a guess, but I think I've seen this interview, or at least something similar, and the kid looks familiar, so we'll just see if I'm right. Anyhow, just a little background before we start. Colton Burpo was a little kid, about 4 if I remember right, when he had a near-death experience after an emergency appendectomy. He said afterwards that he saw Jesus and all that stuff. I'm sure we'll get back to that in a second, but that was only after being brainwashed by hyper-religious parents. There was another very similar case by Alex Malarkey, which I always thought was an appropriate name, but at least Alex, later in life, he recanted the whole thing saying, "I said I went to heaven because I thought it would get me attention." And I'm sure the same thing was going on with Colton. Malarkey also said people have profited from lies and continue to do so. That is also true, and Colton's parents have certainly benefited by keeping him telling the story. They're selling books, there was a movie. This is all making them a lot of cash. And that's really why people keep doing it. In fact, it's an entire literary genre called heavenly tourism. You've got Betty Eadie's Embraced by the Light, and Don Piper's 90 Minutes in Heaven, and 23 Minutes in Hell by Bill Weiss. There's big money in lying for the Lord, and if you can get a kid to do it, that's probably even better, because people tend to believe kids who don't have a direct profit motives, but their parents certainly do. So let's get back and see where this goes, because something tells me it's not going to be impressive.
Okay. Was it colorful or black and white?
It was colorful.
What kinds of colors?
Well, it's all the colors we have here on Earth, and then some more.
Sure, kid, whatever you say. And I guess I was right, although that's not really a big surprise because these things do tend to feature Colton ever since Alex told the truth. So let me ask you a question. What are colors that don't exist on Earth? That would really be something to drill down on, wouldn't it? Because something tells me he would have no answers, because this was all just a dream in the midst of anesthesia. Because we have plenty of cases of people coming out of surgery making these claims. Why? Because when you mess with your brain, you never know what you're going to see. This is exactly why I'm so unimpressed with the idiots who say, well, I took LSD and I saw God. Sure, moron, you screwed up the only mechanism that you have for measuring reality, and you saw things that don't exist in reality. What the hell do you expect? But no, they can't understand where they go wrong because they're not that bright to begin with. Now, granted, it wasn't Colton's fault. He was in for emergency surgery, but he was clearly coached by his hyper-religious parents. If you look at the actual story, the whole thing falls apart, but the religious aren't that bright, are they? They're just looking for reasons to believe.
New colors. Wow. Are there many people in heaven?
Yes, there are a lot of people.
Does heaven look like Earth?
It does have a little bit of the same texture, except it's a place where there is no sin.
Seriously, listen to this kid. He's clearly been coached. Now, keep in mind, this is long after the supposed experience. He was 4 when it happened, and there's been a lot of indoctrination since. I'd estimate he's about 10 in this interview. I don't know, you tell me, but clearly his story has been rehearsed over and over again. That's something that we see from the religious children all the time. Even outside of near-death experiences, you have people like Marjo Gortner, who got used by his parents initially to con people with an elaborate scam filled with lies and false stories, all designed to sell merchandise to the idiot faithful because they're stupid enough to buy it. He at least eventually developed a conscience and was honest about it, just like Alex Malarkey. I'm not saying that Colton is necessarily lying, since he didn't make much money off it himself. I mean, he's currently an electrician. However, understanding how memory works and how malleable it is, that doesn't mean that his story, no matter how strongly he might actually believe it, is true.
So grass and clouds and sky and mountains, how about that? Things like that, just like it looks on Earth?
Yep.
Talk about leading the witness. She knows what will get the reaction from the audience that she wants, and more eyes means more money for her. This is always about making a profit. And as I said, lying for the Lord always has a significant paycheck attached to it. Whoever she works for is paying Colton's parents, and they are making more money through advertising and donations, and the whole scam goes around and around and around again. I mean, really, what else is new?
I know this is a big one. I know you get this question a lot. Are there animals in heaven? Did you see animals?
Yeah, I saw animals, and one of the animals that I enjoyed playing with was the lions.
More childish fantasies, because even other Christians have called bullshit on all of this. Granted, they're all delusional, but many Christians, many denominations in fact, have rejected the story because Colton's story doesn't match up with their own theology. Not that it really means anything, because they're all just making up stories, aren't they? But this doesn't resonate as well with mainstream Christianity as it could. But since you have to rely on a kid who's being manipulated by his parents, he's still going to tell the story that he tells, and his parents didn't starve after this, did they? Of course they didn't. Now, I do want to say that just because they made money off this, and they did make money, that doesn't make it necessarily true or false, any more than if they had rejected all money, that would have made the story more likely to be true. That's not how this works either. It has to be defensible, and none of this ever is. So you got to keep all this stuff in mind, but it's always convenient that they are making a bundle of cash by telling these stories, and that's something that should make everybody very suspicious.
And they were tame?
They didn't hurt people. They were up there, and they were fine.
Was everyone nice in heaven?
Yes, everyone was.
I mean, keep in mind that he was only there for a couple of minutes, supposedly, but he's acting like he lived there for a very long time. Granted, I doubt that anyone has really grilled this kid, even as an adult, on any of the details, because he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it anymore. He just receives his residual checks now and then, but I doubt this book sells much anymore, and he tries to get on with his life. It's hard to believe anyone really takes this stuff seriously, except the morons who are desperate for it to be true. Granted, most of the people who do buy into it are probably like his parents. His father got thrown out of the military for saying that America was at war with Satan, and he wanted to crawl into heaven on all fours, covered in blood. You know, a complete lunatic. That's the kind of upbringing this kid had, and as we know, this always starts very young. That certainly colors the perceptions that Colton went into it with, and his brain was broken from all of the indoctrination, and then he was just running on chemicals and all this shit happened. The whole story is just stupid, but some people just really want to believe.
Was there bad weather?
No.
It was always sunny. Was there night and day?
That's another part that sort of faded, but I'm not really sure. I think it's just day.
We're almost done, but I want to ask you this. What is this supposed to prove to anyone? I mean, other than the softball questions being tossed at a brainwashed kid and a story that is conveniently told, what are we supposed to take away from this? Because honestly, how is this any different than listening to a kid talk about an imaginary friend? Because that's really all that's going on. Then the content gets recycled endlessly by the other con men, like our content creator here on TikTok, because they know that it's going to resonate either to people who are seeing it for the first time and are not aware of the controversy, or by people who saw it before and are getting warm feelings out of nostalgia. None of them are going to ask the hard questions that need to be asked, and for the rest of the world, Colton Burpo is pretty much become forgotten. Whatever comforting story comes next, that's all Christianity will remember. That's why this is all so absurd.
Was there music?
Yes.
The music that you hear in church? Trumpets? Symphonies? What kind of music?
It's hard to describe what sort of music when I was four at the time. But yeah, I heard a lot of stuff.
I mean, you can tell what colors you saw, you can tell us about the animals, but you can't describe the sounds that you heard? That seems a little strange, doesn't it? Of course, that's because this is all just the ramblings of a sick little kid in a compromised state and the brainwashing that he's received, both before and after, from lunatic parents who are trying to make a buck off of their kid. This is the problem. This is all just a scam. If my child had a traumatic experience, I wouldn't put them on TV to recount it over and over and over again. I would protect my child. And the religious don't seem to have that instinct, do they? It wasn't Colton's choice in any of this. It was his parents who just wanted to profit, and they did. They certainly didn't donate their money to charity or refuse to take a cut, because why would they do that, right? I don't know why anyone falls for this stuff, but the religious tend to do it. I was never that dumb, even back when I was a Christian. I never bought into the near-death experiences or the ridiculous stories that made the rounds. I at least had that level of skepticism, but lots of them don't. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? At least, that's how it seems to me. The religious are idiots. There's really no other way to put it. They believe things that cannot be evidentially justified just because it makes them happy, and then they just expect everybody else to buy into it too. Sometimes we need an example of just how lazy their thinking really is. So let's go do some more of that. Let's go back to Frank Turek and watch him say effectively nothing, but confidently, because he doesn't care if any of the things he says are true or defensible. It's all about getting to the finish line so he can collect his prize money without caring if he cheated all along the way. Because the answers he provides are simply not defensible. It's all fee-fees and faith, and this time is no exception. So, here we go again. Take it away, Frank.
My question also has to do with the idea of belief that versus belief in.
Yep.
So, before he gets going, I wanted to explain what that means. I've got no idea if that's going to actually become important as this goes on, but I figure understanding is essential, even if it doesn't necessarily drift that way. This is a pretty common Christian thing these days. I don't really know where it came from exactly, but people like J. Warner Wallace, they talk about it quite a bit. Ultimately, it's just a deepity, something that sounds profound but really isn't. But we'll go over it anyhow. They will say, well, it's one thing to believe that something is true, but it's something else to trust in the supposed truth. Of course, they never talk about how you get to the actual truth in the first place, because they don't actually care about that, do they? To use an example from Wallace, I believe that my ballistic vest can stop a bullet, but then I eventually have to trust the vest to do its job. Well, how about just not getting shot in the first place? That might help, because your trust ultimately means nothing. The science does, but you and your trust, and let's be honest, your faith, they mean absolutely nothing at all. It either works or it doesn't, and when it works or doesn't, that's entirely beyond what you think about it. You don't matter, as I say constantly, and this is something that the religious have a really hard time understanding. But let's get back to it and see where this goes, because I don't predict it's going anywhere intelligent.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we could agree that it's possible for someone to take verses like John 3:16 or the verses from Romans 10, say like if you confess with your mouth Jesus is the Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. It's possible for people to take those out of context.
This is kind of the problem with the religious, one among many. See, the Bible says so many completely contradictory things that they have to find a way to rationalize them all together, and it just doesn't work that way. Different versions of Christianity believe different things because they're all in the Bible somewhere, but someone likes different parts and they have to find a way to explain away all the other stuff that they don't favor in favor of the stuff that they do. Some people will say that it's faith alone. Some people will say you've got to do works, and the faith people dislike the works people and vice versa. Never mind the fact that not one of them have ever shown that there's anything to be saved from, or anyone who can actually save you from it in the first place, because that's kind of the problem, don't you think? So they run around blathering on and on and on about the stuff they really want to be true, without ever stopping to back up that any of it is actually true. Because they just don't care. What else is new?
And even though what they have is belief that, they believe that they have belief in because they're taking those verses out of context. So if that is the case, I guess what does it mean to have belief in, and how does a person know that they have belief in instead of belief that?
Well, there's something known as the witness of the Holy Spirit.
Something you can't show is actually real. Because this is going right back to blind faith. But I really want it to be true. So what? But that's how religion works, isn't it? They are not interested in what is actually demonstrably so. If it sounds good to them on an emotional level, then it's just got to be true, right? So they lie to themselves and to each other, as Frank is doing right here. He's got books to sell and sheep to fleece after all. So he says a bunch of unjustifiable nonsense aimed squarely at the people who are desperate to believe, and he knows they're not going to ask any critical questions because they don't really care if any of it is true or not, just like he doesn't. That's something else that I don't understand. I mean, I always cared. Yes, I believed it, but I always knew that if I found out that it wasn't true, that belief would just evaporate because I cared more about the truth than I did about my own personal emotional comfort. Then when push came to shove and I was faced with the evidence that none of it was actually true, or at least that none of it was at all rationally defensible, I just stopped believing rather than sacrifice my intellectual integrity on the altar of, but I really wish it was so. Unfortunately, the people who follow Frank around, they have no intellectual integrity to begin with. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
That you have this, I know it's a subjective sense because I can't show the witness of the Holy Spirit to you.
That's the problem, though. It's all in your head. But it makes me feel good. So what? Feeling good doesn't mean it's there, and these people, by and large, they're just delusional. They believe things that they can't demonstrate, even to themselves, but they can't ask any of the difficult questions that might make them doubt their faith, because why would they want to do that, right? Because this is all about fifis and faith, nothing more, whereas mine, back in the day, it started off with faith. I don't think I really did the fifis part, but it wound up being all about the evidence because I recognized that my faith meant absolutely nothing once you realized that there was no corroboratory evidence for any of it at all. I wanted that evidence. I wanted to see that this stuff was actually true beyond my own head, and when it turned out to be completely unsupported, I went elsewhere. I joined factual reality, which everyone should do. Frank and his gullible idiots, they can't do that. They don't want to. They're too scared of the real world. That is not something that anyone should be surprised by or impressed by, and it's pathetic that so many people are.
So it's in me, the subject, but it is from an object, the Holy Spirit.
That's just your claim. What the hell else can he do? Now, how about you back it up? Well, they can't, and they won't even try. That's why I keep saying that. If they were making a good faith effort to do so, and more importantly, if they had some hard data to point to that showed that this was even possible, maybe even plausible, if not demonstrably true, I probably wouldn't say. If a rational preponderance of the evidence showed that they could at least plausibly be true, then fine, go ahead and believe. Unfortunately, they just don't have that, do they? They have nothing but fifis and faith. This is just, I really, really like the idea that there's a magical man in the sky, and that's about as much thought as they ever put into it. Then Frank stands there up on stage and makes these empty claims, and everyone in the audience nods like a bunch of brain-damaged bobbleheads because they just really want it to be true too. And I'm sorry, but that's not how things work in the real world. It just isn't.
Who gives you the confidence that what you're believing is true, okay?
That's also not how that works. The delusion that you have in your head gives you the unwarranted confidence that believing in the delusion in your head is true. Frank, you need to seek help. Talk about circular. But that's really all they can do, isn't it? They have no independent demonstrable evidence, no verifiable facts that show that any of the things they believe actually exist. They just like the idea, but liking the idea doesn't make the idea true. These people are morons, and Frank is leading the moron parade right through the middle of Moronville. And this is not a good thing.
Now, here's what thankfully is the case. You can be right and not know why you're right.
And you can be wrong and think that you're right. So how do you tell the difference? My magic 8-ball doesn't think Frank is going to have a clue. Because way back when, I thought I was right. I was firmly convinced that I was right because everyone around me told me that I was right, because they thought they were right too. Then I started to ask questions, and nobody had any intelligent answers. In fact, some people told me to shut the hell up. They thought they were right because everyone had always told them that they were right too. But that doesn't make them right. So instead of listening to the confident yes men I was surrounded with, I went out and I checked it out for myself. And guess what? It didn't turn out that I was right. It turned out that all of my beliefs were unjustified, and instead of saying, well, I'm not going to do that again, and going right back to my blind faith, I dropped the faith and went where the facts led. People like Frank, they can't do that because people like Frank are idiots. Don't be like Frank. You can be a whole lot better.
Right? Most Christians today probably don't know a lot of evidence for Christianity.
Ain't that the truth? I mean, they should, but they don't really care, do they? It just makes them happy, so it's just got to be true, so there. You get people like Frank and other apologists claiming there is evidence, but they can never just trot it out for rational examination, can they? And the few who ever try, they find out that what they claim is evidence really isn't, and they learn to stop trying to prove it to anyone outside the fold ever again. They don't stop claiming that it's evidence because they don't know what evidence actually is. Well, it sounds good to me is not evidence. It only proves that you're an idiot. Knock it off.
And if you were to ask them, what evidence do you have, they might not be able to provide it. Nonetheless, they're right.
Says you, because that's all you can do. You can't show that they're right. That's what the evidence that doesn't exist would do. You can only assert it confidently because you really like the idea. I'm not impressed with what Frank says. I care only what Frank can show. And we all know that he can't show a damn thing, don't we? It's really why they want people to get past believing that and get to believing in. Because believing that ultimately requires corroboration, and believing in doesn't. They want people to get past the point of asking any potentially problematic questions so that people like Frank Turek don't have to try so hard. Once you reach the point of really wanting it to be true, you'll follow these shyster apologists around by the nose because you're too dumb to do otherwise. And that is not a good thing.
That they are saved and they have trusted in Jesus. And if you go throughout the centuries, people didn't have access to this kind of evidence.
What kind of evidence? What are you actually claiming here, Frank? I doubt he's going to say, because that tends to be self-defeating, but if he can claim he has evidence and people are conditioned not to ask what that evidence is, just believe on faith that it exists, he doesn't have to work very hard, does he? He just has to make the comforting claims, and everybody in the audience will just agree, because that's what they want to be true, even if it actually isn't. This is how so many people get conned, because they're just stupid. Some prince in Nigeria wants to send you a bunch of money if only you'll send him your banking information. They just want it to be true, so they do it and suffer the consequences. Then they act surprised when their bank account is emptied out, and Frank is doing essentially the same thing, often with similar results. All your money ends up in the collection plate, and Frank is off to the next town to try the scam again. I don't understand why so many people are this stupid, but clearly they are.
Right? Yet the witness of the Holy Spirit still helps save people. So it's not like you have to know a lot of belief that in order to become a Christian. Most people become Christians with very little belief that.
Most people are idiots, which is exactly what people like Frank depend on. He wants dumb people who are willing to believe his pie in the sky claims uncritically. That's what makes the scam work. Know your audience and tell them what they want to hear, and you'll walk out with their money in your pocket and them begging to give you more. He's not backing up any of his claims rationally, you notice. He just knows what they want to hear. And that doesn't make any of it true, but he understands their inherent mental weaknesses and he exploits them. Tell me you don't understand this. Go ahead, tell me.
Yet they're still Christians. But, of course, the scriptures say you ought to have a reason for the hope that you have. You ought to be able to demolish arguments. You ought to be able to reason together. You ought to be set in defense of the gospel, as Paul says.
But you can't. That's the problem. You've got nothing, and you know you've got nothing. Or at least you should know that. That's why he claims that there is evidence. He never details what that is, but it's just got to be there because the Bible says there should be. Then these people go into debates and they get totally destroyed because there isn't actually any evidence there. Assertions of evidence is not actual evidence for anything. And they don't understand that because they've relied on people like Frank to give them the lowdown. And then Frank lies to them and they wind up making fools of themselves. Now, Frank could be as delusional as they are. He could really believe this stuff too, but he's been corrected on multiple occasions, and that pushes him from being a blind believer to being a complete con man. At least, I don't see how he could be anything else. He would have to be seriously Dane-bramaged to still believe any of this crap, but I guess you never know. It's not an excuse regardless. You should know better, and if you don't, then there is something seriously wrong with you. And I think that explains a lot, don't you?
So you can be right and not know why you're right. You can't share it. And maybe this distinction will help. There's a difference between knowing Christianity's true and showing Christianity's true.
Yes, there is, but if you can't show that Christianity is true, then you don't know it either. The showing is how you justify the knowing. What you're talking about is believing, not knowing. And I think it's shocking just how many people don't know the difference between those two things. Because knowledge is facts, information, and skills acquired by a person through experience or education, the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. It's stuff backed up by demonstrable evidence. Evidence that can be tested and verified to be factually correct outside of your own head. Whereas faith, using the Hebrews 11:1 definition, is stuff you just want to be true. Not stuff that actually is, it's stuff that you want to believe. So really, Frank is just talking about having faith that Christianity is true, and then just mislabeling it as fact and knowledge because it has a stronger impact. He knows how to pander to his crowd such that they're going to pass over their money to him. That doesn't make any of it honest or true, but this is Frank Turek we're talking about, isn't it?
You can know it's true because you have this witness of the Holy Spirit, and you've had answered prayer, which is evidence, by the way, and you've had certain things happen in your life, and you go, yeah, God has been witnessing to me, the Holy Spirit has been guiding me.
And all of that is just bullshit. You don't have a demonstrable witness of anything. He already admitted that. You don't have verifiable answered prayer because we have studies on that, and prayer works at a rate indistinguishable from random chance. And all he can really do is just appeal to things that you interpret as God, but you can't show is actually God. That's why I've always said that interpretations mean nothing. Well, it sounds like God to me. Well, how the hell would you know that? How do you know what God is actually like? They all seem to think they do, but how do they really? Because they don't. It's all just made up bullshit in their heads because they really want it to be true. But that is not at all impressive. You don't just get to point to something and say, well, that's God's work. How the hell do you know that? Ask them those questions because they have no answers. How do you know? How do you know it wasn't Satan's work? That'll just freak some of them out, won't it? How do you know? Don't let up until they have an answer other than faith and fifis. And that could be a very long night.
But you might not be able to show that to somebody else. For showing, we need something that we can all view, like arguments we've been giving.
How exactly do you view an argument? What you need is evidence, but they don't actually have any of that, do they? If they did, they could just trot it out, but they never can. The evidence is in the showing, not in the telling. If you can only tell people that you have evidence, then you don't have evidence. You have faith, and faith is not impressive. Every time one of them tries to present evidence in big air quotes, it's always laughably terrible, right? Full of interpretation and I just really want it to be true. But that is not how evidence works. So they turn to arguments, and they are universally awful and full of logical fallacies, and they don't actually prove anything. They don't even understand how reality functions, which is probably why they're all quivering helplessly in their religious safe spaces, right? They are afraid of the real world. That's why they insist on living in the fantasy version they all made up together in their heads. But that doesn't help anything. It just makes you look like a complete moron.
That's showing. But showing and knowing are two different things.
Would you say primarily the witness of the Holy Spirit that defines to a person if they have that belief in or not?
Now, it could just be me, but listening to this guy, it sure sounds like he's asking a couple of potentially dangerous questions, right? Because someone who's really confident in their beliefs, they wouldn't be there at the microphone, would they? Or at least I wouldn't be. Of course, it's hard to really know how I would react if I was still one of the gullibly faithful, but people are walking away from religion at a rate never before seen in history. So hopefully this guy's going to be one of them, because nothing Frank is saying is worth a damn.
If you're worried about whether or not you have belief in, you have belief in.
Because Frank says so. This really feels like he's trying to get this kid away from the microphone, doesn't it? I think Frank knows that this could be dangerous if it goes on too much longer. Of course, if you look behind him, most of the people in the audience, and this kind of looks like it's a talk at a school or something like that, but most of them really look bored. They're looking at their phones and talking to each other, and most of them aren't paying a whole lot of attention. Half the seats are empty, so it's not like Frank is exactly packing them in, right? Granted, I don't know the situation, and I'm not going to pretend that I do, but this does not look like a particularly enthusiastic crowd. Granted, the Q&A part usually happens at the end of the talk, but it doesn't look like a whole lot of people stuck around to see what Frank had to say, does it?
You know, because I know some people are just kind of like a little in their own heads thinking, am I really saved? That kind of thing. If you're worried about whether or not you're saved, you're saved. Okay?
That's just a claim. Of course, the whole thing is just a claim. Nothing Frank has said is anything but a claim, and he knows it. If you're wondering if you're a genius, then you're a genius. No, that's actually testable, unlike everything that Frank has been spewing. Frank is just spewing fifis and faith because he knows that's what his intended audience is going to lap up. But that doesn't make any of it true, does it? Frank isn't there for truth, and neither is his audience. Although granted, this audience looks like they're so bored, I don't know why the hell they're there in the first place. They are usually just there to get an emotional diatribe that they can go home and feel good about, so they don't have to think intelligently about any of this crap. They don't want to think, they just want to feel. And feeling doesn't matter, but that's all they've got, isn't it? It's not like they can use their brains for anything but holding up their hats, at least when it comes to their religions.
It's the people that said, oh, I had a profession of faith when I was a kid, and then they're living like hell. Look, if you're living like hell, you're probably going there because you haven't been regenerated. But if the witness in the Holy Spirit is convicting you of sin and is telling you, do this and don't do this, and you want to follow Jesus, you're saved.
Because Frank Turek says so. That's not really what the Bible says, not that the Bible actually means anything, but this is Frank Turek's own personal theology that he thinks will resonate with the idiots in the audience because that's how he makes a buck. Somebody is paying for his time here. He's not doing this for free. This is just a stage show, although I guess this time he's not literally on a stage like he usually is. Someone really needs to get up and ask him questions that he can't answer and hold his feet to the fire, but that would never make it onto his channel, would it? Because Frank knows how to self-promote, and that isn't it.
If there's no witness of the Holy Spirit, if there's no urging you to stay out of sin and to do good works for Jesus, you're probably not saved.
But since there is no demonstrable Holy Spirit to begin with, what difference does it make? How do you tell the difference between an internal monologue and some invisible spook in your head? That's a question that never gets asked, isn't it? Because chances are, and we'll give them the benefit of the doubt here, that the overwhelming majority of Christians who think they've been touched by God are really just misinterpreting their own internal brain state. These people misinterpret a whole lot, don't they? That's why you have to ask a lot of hard questions, and they simply aren't capable. How do you know that the things that you believe are actually true? Where is your evidence? And it seems to me is irrelevant. Nobody cares how it seems to you. We care what is actually going on in demonstrable reality, and you need more than your fifis and faith to get there, and these people just don't care. That's why they fall for Frank's bullshit. They are looking for comfort, not facts. And it's the facts that matter, not the comfort. You people are just making complete fools of yourselves. Grow the hell up.
But it's only you that can know that.
No, it's only you that can believe that. Knowledge has to be justified, and you people aren't even trying. You can't just say, because I say so, or because I believe it, or because I have faith. That doesn't make it true. It's like the people who say, by definition, God is like this. Says who? How do you know that? Not how can you assert it, not how can you have faith in it, since your unsupported assertions mean nothing and your faith is bullshit. How do you know? Where did you get the information that led to that conclusion such that we can test it objectively to see if it is worthwhile? And of course, they have nothing and they don't care. They're just in this for the emotional comfort, making claims about objective reality that are not defensible in the real world because they don't give a crap about the real world. That's what we have to point out. Not that they will care because, as I said, they're just in it for the fifis and faith, and they couldn't care less about the facts. And that's just pathetic. So what do you think about this? Frank is a fraud, we know that, but he's always got a script to get him wherever he wants to go, and most of the people in his audience, when he can get an audience that isn't bored out of their minds, they will just embrace it because they're not that intelligent to begin with. I guess if you have no intellectual integrity or an honest bone in your body, it's a way to make a living, but it's kind of morally questionable at best and reprehensible at worst, and I think that describes Frank Turek and all the other apologists. Lying for the Lord is nothing to be proud of, but really, what else can they do? It's not like these idiots have any other marketable skills, do they? No, their audience just really wants to believe, but that doesn't make any of it true. But hey, Frank is willing to lie to them for $1, so what else is new? Sadly, none of these people care if any of the things they believe is true. And that makes this whole thing really, really pathetic. Are you ready? For some more religious stupidity, I mean, because that's all we ever see around here, right? I wish there was something better to go after, but no one has been able to suggest a single theist with a brain in their head, and this is no different. So here we go. I really wish the religious had a clue, but we all know otherwise. That is especially true of the con men that just lie for the Lord and make a living screwing over the religiously gullible. How is that something that is acceptable in this day and age? Why aren't more people calling it out? I honestly don't get it. Can we please stop being nice to these morons and start calling a spade a spade? Because that would sure be nice, wouldn't it?
Jesus is coming soon, but what is that supposed to do inside your life?
Of course, this has nothing at all to do with atheists. I just want to throw that out there up front. Because you can't show that Jesus ever existed or is ever going to come back. In fact, it seems pretty ridiculously far-fetched and absurd at this point, doesn't it? So if he was making this for atheists, that's the point that I'd stop him and expect him to back up his claims, and we all know he couldn't do it. Because really, this is just another reason why they never want to talk to us. We ask too many impertinent questions. We want them to produce evidence for far too many things. They can't do it, and that's why they fail to convince the non-believers. It's why this stuff only works on the religiously deluded and gullible. Because they're stupid, and we're not. But I guess the question is, assuming that we buy into his theological bullshit, which we certainly don't and shouldn't, but what is this supposed to do inside of your life? Well, nothing. Nothing at all. Oh, I know he wants people to say, I have to get more pious, or I have to live as I think Jesus would want me to live. But that's nonsense, isn't it? You're already fucked or saved from before you were born. If God knows everything with perfect clarity and cannot be wrong, then you were born to be saved or damned, and there's nothing at all you can do about it because God can't make mistakes. This is another reason why being a Christian is such a complete waste of time. Because it doesn't matter what you do, God knows where you're headed no matter what, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that kind of sucks, huh?
That's supposed to get you prepared in Christ by turning to Him with all of your heart.
What difference does that make? The only way that would matter is if God wasn't omniscient, if he doesn't know everything that will happen with perfect clarity. You'd have to get rid of all the silly omni properties, and most Christians, most theists, they're not willing to do that, are they? So long as that's the case, playing make-believe for a moment, then it doesn't matter what you do because you have no free will. You can't. Free will simply cannot exist in a world with a God with any omni-properties. The very theology makes you entirely irrelevant. Of course, they can't admit that because then they'd all be out on the street corner with a cup full of pencils because their view of their imaginary friends really screws over their claims, doesn't it? So, what do? They lie about it. They have to, because this isn't about truth, this is about making a buck. There are some groups out there that have accepted what the theology actually teaches. The Calvinists, which are really not all that popular, all things considered, they believe that you're saved or you're fucked no matter what, and it doesn't really matter what you do. At least not the hardcore Calvinists who would look at their beliefs rationally, because religion is simply not rational. They're kind of like the Jehovah's Witnesses in that regard, who believe or believed, I don't know what's currently going on, that once there were 144,000 people going to heaven, the world would end. Except they've been wrong about that many times over, right? They've had to keep revising their theology to remain remotely relevant. What else is new though, right?
What's the use of you knowing that he's coming soon and you're not even on his word, prayer, worship daily? You're not even having a daily relationship with the Lord.
I mean, from an atheist perspective, there's no reason to do that if you can't even prove the Lord exists. That's why he's not talking to us. He can't just talk fast to delusional idiots who really wish it was true, and they're just not smart enough to ask any intelligent questions. Skepticism is the death of religious faith. There's no reason whatsoever to take any of this seriously, but this guy doesn't care about that, does he? He's just got some sheep to fleece and some idiots to con, and that tends to be all that really matters to apologists. Now, Dan McClellan recently made a video on the uselessness of apologists, whose entire job is to convince the already faithful to stick around, and I had to comment on that video that apologists are just spiritual conmen with their hands out for your money, and Dan actually liked that, not that it matters. Of course, for someone who knows that there's no good reason whatsoever to believe any of this crap, he's still a Mormon, isn't he? So I don't really know what to tell you. Compartmentalization is unfortunately a thing, and it really shouldn't be, should it?
The reason why he tells you this is to let you know, take it very seriously.
And why should you care about that? Again, if God is omni-whatever, you're either saved or screwed no matter what you do, because God already knows where you're headed no matter what you do. He knows what you're going to do regardless of your efforts, and he can't be wrong. So why do you care? Just live the life that you want to live, if you have a choice, because without free will you don't really have a choice, do you? And you'll wind up wherever God foresaw you going, and it doesn't really matter. Hell, I could be going to heaven, not that I have any interest, and I'm not remotely concerned, because I see no rational reason whatsoever to think that any gods are real, and neither do you.
He's coming soon for his bride. Are you that bride? Yes, if you truly turn to Jesus and seek him with all of your heart.
That's one thing that I really hate about these short-form preaching sessions, because they have no time to explain anything. Granted, I think that's why there are so many of these on YouTube, because they don't want to have to explain anything. They are relying on the inbred stupidity of existing believers to do all the heavy lifting, and that really shouldn't be acceptable, should it? So why am I supposed to buy into any of this, especially given that I probably know more about your religion and your stupid book than you do? Well, because knowledge is frowned upon in theological circles. They don't want you to know anything. They just want you to shut up, sit down in the pews, and believe it on blind faith, because then they get paid and you're not a problem. They don't like problems. They don't want problems. They just want ignorant, pliable idiots who will do exactly what they say and hand over their wallets. And we have a word for that, right? What is that word? Let me think. Oh yeah, scam artist. Because that's all these people are.
Subscribe and follow for more.
No thanks. As Dan McClellan would say, I'm good. Because, as we all know, they are not talking to anyone with a brain, because brains really short-circuit their theological nonsense. They really only care about dumb people who are going to sit in the pews and empty the contents of their wallets into the collection plate on Sunday morning so that the con men get paid and the scam can continue. This is what it has always been about. Conning the gullible into parting with their hard-earned cash over and over and over again. Of course, they're not talking to us because we would never do that. At least, I hope we wouldn't, but I've seen some pretty dumb things that atheists have done, and we'll not go into that. I'd like to think that we're smarter than that. At least, I wouldn't do that. That's about as much as I can say. You can let me know in the comments what you do, and hopefully you're going to be pretty smart about it, because I've seen really dumb people, and I'm tired of really dumb people. In fact, why don't you go do that now? What do you think about all of these half-assed con men trying to use pre-existing indoctrination to their advantage? Are you disgusted by it as much as I am? Let me know. Because this is how the religious world works, and it always has. Hopefully, there is an end in sight, because these people really need to go away. It might not make humanity any smarter, although that would be really nice, wouldn't it? But maybe it'll make humanity a little less gullible. And wouldn't that be a good thing? The religious have a problem, and that problem is that they assume that they're right about absolutely everything, and then just refuse to accept answers that fall outside of their blind faith. You have to believe in my God because reasons. No, I don't. Yes, you do. It's really kind of pathetic. So we're going to see some more of that coming up, and it's going to be no more impressive today than it has been at any time in the past. Because these people are really dumb. So let's get going. Let's do some more Frank Turek, not because I really want to, but because he just won't shut his fat mouth and, hey, he's a convenient target, isn't he? He asks how atheists can solve a moral dilemma, but he only accepts answers that slot into his existing religious beliefs. Frank is just kind of an idiot that way, isn't he? It's not something to be proud of, but hey, what can you expect? So let's go watch him make a complete fool of himself as he always does, and that should be fun, right?
Never said that atheists can't be moral. I never said atheists don't know morality.
You just don't think that they can justify it without your imaginary friend. And you're wrong. Yes, we'll let him keep going in a second, but this is the corner that virtually all apologists have been forced into. They used to say, back in the day, that atheists just couldn't be moral. Then it turned out that atheists not only could be moral, but were far more moral than the religious are by and large. FBI prison entry statistics prove that. There are far more Christians in prison versus their numbers on the outside than there are atheists versus their numbers on the outside. And that's a pretty wide margin too. Christians are the immoral assholes, not us. So they've just rationalized their way into yet another excuse. That it's not the actual morality that matters, because obviously atheists can be moral, but how we can justify it. And honestly, it all comes down to, I don't get it, which is a completely irrelevant claim. It doesn't matter what you get, it matters what you can prove. You don't get to just push your moral system onto others and then complain that because everyone else doesn't embrace your moral system, that somehow they're just wrong. Yeah, fuck you, Frank. Fuck you.
In fact, atheists know morality just like everybody else. We know morality because it's written on our hearts.
That's your claim, but you have no means whatsoever of proving that it's actually true. And let's be honest, they don't care. Frank is not here to debate with atheists. He's terrified of us. I don't think he even debates atheists anymore, at least not that I've seen recently, but I guess who the hell knows. He has gotten so completely trashed that now he's just playing the I don't think so card, which means absolutely nothing. Nobody cares what you think, Frank. We care what you can prove, and you can't prove a damn thing. Except that you're a dishonest scam artist, and we've known that all along. That's why he's in a church talking to delusional morons in the pews instead of up on a stage at a skeptics convention trying to convince them. Because this is not at all about reality. This is about conning the gullible into giving him money. And what the hell else is new in that?
What I'm saying is that atheists can't justify morality.
See? Told you so. Now, we're going to set that aside for the moment because we absolutely can. Frank just won't accept it, and that's why he's such an absurd laughingstock. The fact is, he can't justify his own moral views. All he can do is make empty claims. I believe that God gives me morality. Yep, sorry, I don't buy that. Prove it in some verifiable way that your God exists. Frank can't do it, so there goes any chance at rational justification that he might have. Just because you believe it, that doesn't make it true. So all he's doing here is saying, you don't meet my standards of morality, so you're not justified in your views. Well, who the hell cares about your standards? Certainly not me, because your standards haven't been demonstrated to be valid. That's why you're on a stage in front of a bunch of people who are too stupid to figure this whole thing out. Because they're not asking any of the rational questions that they need to be. They just want to believe. So, whose standards are we going to go by here, Frank? Yours? Why? I think yours are stupid, and I'm not going to go with your farcical fiction manual until you can prove it's actually worthwhile. You are not impressing anyone, Frank. Stop being an asshole.
That's the point. In fact, I had to say this several times to Christopher Hitchens.
While he was kicking your ass. Because seriously, Hitch won every single encounter that they ever had. Frank would never agree, of course, but, fuck Frank. This is what happens when you start off with a conclusion that you can never admit is wrong because you're emotionally attached to it and stubborn. This is why so many of them insist on starting from a Christian perspective, and that's entirely fallacious. You don't just get to say, my beliefs are true because I like them, and you have to accept them too, or else. No, we don't. I just laugh in Frank's face because my justification doesn't have to coincide with his faith. He's the one with no justification because he can't prove that any of his beliefs are true. I like it doesn't get you anywhere. You have to actually prove it's true, and we all know that Frank can't do shit.
Christopher, I'm not saying you're a bad guy. Christopher, I'm not saying you don't know morality. In fact, I like Christopher. I thought he was a good guy. What I'm saying is you can't justify why not murder innocent people to get what you want.
Because if you did that, you'd go to jail. This is honestly not that hard. If we allowed people to do that, society would break down. I don't want society to break down, so I don't do things that would logically lead to that end. It's entirely justified, but Frank doesn't like that because he's only after his imaginary friend and not remotely objective truth. All he can do is run home to Papa because that's where he's emotionally comforted, but that is not how rational discourse works, is it? I don't get it is irrelevant. I don't like it means nothing. Why do we not do it? Because that's how human morality works, and human morality has nothing at all to do with your silly sky daddy. Get it through your head, Frank. You're a moron.
That's the point. It's a point about ontology, not a point about epistemology.
No, it's actually not. Epistemology is about how you know things. Ontology is about the nature of being. The only one that means anything in this case is epistemology. But Frank's epistemic standard is shit. He doesn't care what's actually true. He cares only what makes him feel good, and that's why he starts off with all of his religious beliefs smuggled in on his side. That's why we really need to laugh in these morons' faces, because that's all they've earned. Everything that they are doing is completely dishonest. Big surprise there.
It's not a point about how you know the moral law, it's a point about why does the moral law exist.
But you're the only one insisting that there has to be a moral law in the first place. You have not justified that. You just really like the idea. There are no moral laws in the real world, at least none that we can demonstrate. We might make laws with moral implications, but morality itself? That just isn't real as an individual thing. It's just something that we make up, and Frank will never accept that because he doesn't like the idea. He can't. His whole shtick demands that he doesn't. Again, he's not talking to us, and I don't think he was really talking to Christopher Hitchens either. He was just preaching to the people in the audience on his side because he couldn't actually defeat Hitchens or anybody else in a direct head-to-head match. He gets his ass handed to him every single time. Nothing else can happen because he's so incoherent. He's reading from a script, not directly responding to what anyone else is saying to him. Because he doesn't care. This is why Frank is one of the worst of the apologists out there, and that's in a field of universally horrible people. I find it bizarre just how many of these people can't figure out where they're going wrong, especially because we spend a lot of time telling them where they're going wrong. But, they're not that bright, are they? And they don't care. Reality is not something to which they aspire, because they're idiots. And that is not a good thing. The Catholics are a special kind of irrational because honestly, they do not care about the facts. Not at all. So long as the church gets money and, victims, they couldn't care less how batshit insane their beliefs actually are. Then they pander to the already clueless in the pews, and we're gonna rip that apart today. Sounds fun, right? The religious are really bad at this, aren't they? Today's video from the Thomistic Institute, a Catholic think tank with the biggest air quotes in the world, is called "Can Nominalism Deny the Existence of God?" And then he doesn't even try to defend the existence of God at all because, of course he doesn't. This is just an assertion, nothing more. And the second that you take it apart, the whole thing crashes and burns because his argument is really crap. Let's not keep the man waiting, though. Here we go down a very deep, very dark, very stinky well. Someone throw us a line because we're going to need to climb out sooner or later.
Previously on Aquinas 101, we looked at an argument for the existence of God that some have called the existence argument.
We didn't see it, so sorry, I can't really speak to that. I could go back and look, but I really don't want to. However, arguments are not evidence, so it really doesn't matter. We need evidence, not "it seems to me" nonsense. Granted, we never get any actual evidence because all of the things that they're spouting on about are just concepts they made up in their head that they really, really, really wish were true, even though they cannot be demonstrated in any verifiable way. Not that they care because, fee-fees, but they can't understand where they're going wrong, can they? So I figure that we're in for some more of that because that's virtually all religious videos that we ever look at. So strap in because this is probably going to get bumpy.
I examined how we could formulate the argument and then discussed why we should accept the first premise of the argument as true.
Oh good, maybe we can address that last video without having to go and watch it. So let's see. If diverse things are the same in some way, then something is the cause of that sameness. Well, that's assuming that said sameness was meant to happen, and you've got no evidence for that, do you? That is, of course, just an assertion, and unsupported assertions mean jack squat. I don't even have to be reading ahead, although granted, I did a little. It's right there on the screen and all, but I could just say everything that we know of is made of atoms or quarks. It depends on how far you go, therefore something had to cause it. Of course, he just wants to get to his imaginary friend because the thing that he wants to think caused everything to be made of smaller stuff, well, that doesn't actually have to be intelligent or have a mind or be a being or anything like that. It could just be physics doing what physics does, which is exactly what the science shows. There was no more intentionality to it than if I put a kettle on the burner and turn the burner on. It boils at a specific temperature, no design required. I mean, depending on where you are and the atmospheric pressure, of course, but there is no intentionality there. Physics didn't just decide that water would boil at one temperature at sea level and one temperature at the top of a mountain. That is not how this works.
However, I did leave us with a cliffhanger. Can a nominalist accept premise 1? That if diverse things are the same in some way, then something is the cause of this sameness.
I don't know, since I'm not a nominalist, and it seems to me doesn't mean anything, but nominalists are people who think that universal ideas are just names that don't have any correspondence with objective reality. To some degree, that's true because a chair is just the label that we attach to some of the stuff we sit on, and it doesn't actually mean anything outside of our heads. This is really why I'm not particularly interested in arguing definitions or concepts like this without having them linked to actual reality in some demonstrable way. It all comes down to word games, and I think that's boring. So, sure, go ahead, tell us a story, because that's all that really matters to the religious, right?
Stick around to find out. Because many people today are explicitly or implicitly nominalist, this is a very important question. However, before I unpack this topic, let us just review the argument once more. It goes like this.
And I'll take the time to actually unpack it, because that's kind of what I do. Not that it matters to the religious. I've already done the first premise, and that premise is hopelessly flawed from the get-go, because a cause is not the same thing as a God, which is really where this is going. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't feature on a religious channel, would it? Because you have to remember what they're doing, and this is why the Kalam fails, because they are internally equating cause with God done it, and that does not follow rationally. God is not the automatic answer for any question that you do not have an immediate and emotionally comforting answer to. Yet that is exactly how the religious treat it, right? This is why the religious are so ludicrously dumb. And that's not something to be proud of, sorry.
1. If diverse things are the same in some way, then something is the cause of this sameness. 2. All diverse existing things exist.
All of them? Can you actually show that that's the case? No, of course not. Because I can imagine plenty of diverse things that don't exist. And saying existing things exist, as he does here, that's just a tautology. Now, tautologies aren't direct fallacies, but they do occur in numerous fallacies indirectly, so I'm just going to call bullshit here. That's why, and if you pay attention, you'll see this all the time, but religious arguments, they're actually built backwards, starting with the conclusion that they really want to reach for entirely emotional reasons, and then just trying to fill in the other parts so that they can get there. That's why if you examine a lot of religious philosophical arguments, they will simply declare that some parts of the argument that they desperately need to be true are just true. No evidence required, because otherwise they just can't get to where they want to go. Like I said before, it's all about word games and not remotely about logic or evidence or trying to get to the actual truth. Because, why the hell would the religious care about that?
3. Therefore, something is the cause of existence.
With your religious beliefs just substituting God for something, of course. Because, again, this isn't an actual argument for any God, much less your own specific God, even though internally you're just filling in the pieces because you really want that God to be true. This is exactly why Kalam fails, because God isn't even mentioned, just like we have here. This is not an argument for God, because your conclusion must actually mention God, and it doesn't. These things aren't intended for rational people. They only pander to the religiously desperate, because they're going to do all of the rest of the work themselves in their own heads. Now, this is something that I've talked about before, because they tend to use God as a placeholder for all their wishes and their dreams and their whatever. They invent a magical father figure in the sky because they can't handle questions that are not immediately answered in an emotionally comforting way. These people aren't doing credible philosophy. They are engaged in apologetics, and the two are simply not the same thing. So this argument fails on every conceivable level, whether you're a nominalist or not. So we can just consider this video already debunked, but I figure it has to be going somewhere. So let's get back to it and see.
The reason why a nominalist might deny premise 1 is because one way of understanding sameness in the first premise is that things are the same if and only if they have the same form. But nominalists deny that there are common forms shared by many individuals. So under this interpretation, it seems like a nominalist has a good reason to reject the truth of premise 1.
I have plenty of reasons to reject premise 1 that have absolutely nothing at all to do with nominalism. I'm not going to just let you run down the primrose path from cause to creator to God, as the religious desperately want to do. Because the argument is worthless as stated, and you can't just jump to where you really wish to be without just making bald assertions and rationalizing your way there. You simply cannot get to any God without being able to demonstrate that God is real first, and the religious, they aren't even trying, are they? It's still just a word game, and those are meaningless to anyone concerned with actual truth. Remember, premise 2 is basically a tautology, which makes it useless as a credible premise to begin with. It's just stating your belief confidently in such a way that the religiously clueless might not catch on. This isn't getting him anywhere, is it? But did we really expect it to? I don't think so.
In response to this objection, I should first remind everyone that in the last episode, I said that sameness can be the result of any of the 4 causes, not just the formal cause.
And we still didn't see it, so I guess we'll have to see if he explains. Now, this comes out of Aristotle, where there were 4 main causes that were material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. And this goes back to the religious being inordinately interested in ancient thinkers. That's why they're always talking about people like Aquinas, right? Yet I don't care about Aquinas or Aristotle at all. We've done a whole lot more work than that today. It all comes down to this guy said a thing, and that doesn't matter. I mean, Aristotle was just wrong about a lot of things. He believed that women had fewer teeth than men. He believed that eels didn't reproduce. He was completely wrong about bee reproduction. The list of what he was wrong about goes on and on and on and on and on. It might have been the best that he could do at the time, but he was still demonstrably wrong. There really is no need to pay any attention to Aristotle or Aquinas or any of the other people that the religious really love to flog. It's time to grow up and move on. Give it a shot.
So objects that share the same matter or the same final cause or even the same efficient cause all have sameness without there needing to be a form that they all share.
Which, as I already said, is completely irrelevant. I mean, I think nominalism is kind of irrelevant, although I guess that's just a matter of degrees. This is just Ambrose here trying to convince the religiously gullible that he's right, even though he has no evidence for anything. This isn't a search for reality, this is a search for conformity. That just makes this whole thing a complete waste of time. But honestly, can't we say that for any religious video out there? These people are clueless, and that's nothing that you should be proud of.
So clearly, sameness in the first premise is not necessarily the result of having the same form. But even in the way a nominalist uses language, there is a cause or a reason why we give diverse individuals the same name.
I know he thinks that's profound, but it really isn't. This whole thing is just mental masturbation, which is really all religion is. It's the desperate attempt to get to where you really want to go, even if where you really want to go is really dumb. That's why so much of apologetics is trying to explain away the clear and obvious problems that religious faith has. But we really want it to be true. That doesn't matter. It's why philosophy, at least the way that it's used by the religious, is pretty much always irrelevant. But it's really all they've got, isn't it? And that's just sad.
On the nominalist view, different individuals are given the same name because of convention, or even just because the individual knower decides to group together a number of individuals under the same name. Either way, even if names are mere conventions or mental fictions, there is nevertheless a cause for using the same name applying to many individuals, namely the human mind.
And because everyone has to be just like he is, he's right. I'm sorry, reality doesn't work that way. Really, the only reason that people do the same things like this is because of social convention. They are just indoctrinated into it. When you have to communicate with a lot of people around you in order to survive, you gotta start somewhere, don't you? A lot of those somewheres come down to biology and our environment. We've still got to deal with the objectively real world around us, whether we want to or not. And it's really too bad that the religious fight against that so hard, but they're just pathetic, aren't they?
So even if we were to accept the most radical version of nominalism, when we say that many individuals are the same in some respect, there is a cause of that sameness, even if that cause just is the human mind.
And you can't even demonstrate that that's true. Granted, we're getting into hard solipsism territory, but he's stating things confidently that cannot be stated confidently because we have no actual evidence in that regard. I'm trying not to derail him entirely because, as I said, I've got no real horse in this fight. I'm not a nominalist, I'm a realist, and I'm certainly not trying to get to any gods like the religious desperately are. So I can be a complete outsider here and just peer in through the bars like I'm watching a cage full of monkeys. But actually, monkeys would be smarter than the religiously delusional because they aren't after the facts. They just really want to believe.
With that in mind, it seems safe to say that most people should accept the truth of the first premise. We now turn to the second premise, which states that all diverse existing things exist.
Which, as I said, is just a tautology. You can take diverse out entirely because it's irrelevant in the sentence. All things that exist, exist. Big deal. This is just being treated as a transition between the first premise and the conclusion, and it does absolutely nothing to add to it. It's like the apologetic arguments that just state God exists as a premise. But that's not a premise. That's an actual conclusion. It's complete nonsense. You have to prove that, and they don't even try. That's why this really isn't going to get him anywhere, because he's already emotionally invested in his conclusion, and he doesn't much care about anything else. That's why arguments aren't evidence, because they're just claims, constructed in such a way to comfort the already faithful. That doesn't make them remotely true or intellectually defensible, though. Not like the religious care.
I want to begin by noting that my formulation is supposed to be expressing the following sentence. But being is found to be common to all things, however otherwise different. I have added the slight modification that, quote, all things, however otherwise different, end quote, are diverse existing things, to make it clear that St. Thomas is not talking about non-existing things.
You mean like gods? Because we have no evidence for those whatsoever. Again, not like they care. It all comes down to those things that exist, exist, which is worthless and adds absolutely nothing to the formulation. once you learn to see through their word games, religious apologetics completely fall apart. And in fact, it's not just the religious that have this problem. Tons of straight philosophers engage in this as well, because you can come to any conclusion in philosophy that you want, no matter how absurd, just by how you string your premises together. All you need is a receptive audience, and Bob's your uncle. That's not how you get to demonstrable truth, though. Not that they are at all remotely interested.
Essentially, what this premise means is that all diverse existing things are the same insofar as they exist.
Big deal. Stating a tautology doesn't make it useful, any more than Jordan Peterson arguing over what is means is useful. These are just tactics to appeal to dumb people, or in the case of Peterson, to give him time to make up more nonsense because that's really all he spouts, right? Empty deepities add nothing at all to the rational conversation because he isn't interested in being rational. I don't think this guy is either. How is establishing that things have causes move the needle one step closer to the existence of a real demonstrable God? No clue. I'd really like to know what he hopes to establish with this, but that's where Faith and Fifis come in, and that's just stupid.
And so existence is pointed out as the common feature that must have a common cause.
But it doesn't. A cause is not necessarily a common cause. I exist because my parents fucked. My parents fucking has nothing at all to do with why my wife exists. She exists because her parents fucked. Two entirely different causes, two very similar outcomes. Yet he's trying to get to his imaginary friend without having any evidence whatsoever to back him up because he just really wants it to be true. Oh, and he makes money from that. You can't forget the money. So we're still stuck looking for a useful meaning that any of this might have, and I have no idea what he thinks he's going to be able to do if we exclude empty claims and word games, because that seems to be all he's got in his arsenal. That doesn't impress me one bit. How about you? Let me know down in the comments if you can't see right through this crap, because I certainly can.
If this is true, then the argument follows easily that there must be a cause of existence.
But not what that cause might have been, or that it was a single cause, or that that cause was your God. This is where he's going completely wrong and trying to smuggle in his theology without having any reason whatsoever to take his theology seriously. This is what they always do. But this should not impress anyone, because it's really, really dumb. Anyhow, that's where we're going to stop for the week. I want to give you the opportunity to put your views down in the comments. Is this just as dumb as it seems to be at first glance? Let me know what you think. Yes or no? This kind of thing tends to be rampant among the Catholics especially, who, let's be honest, they really don't give a damn about the truth of their beliefs at all. But if they can make you feel good and make the Catholic Church some money, well, hey, it's got to be right, right? And presumably, they're also looking to provide some young children to diddle, although they're not going to admit to that one, but hey, this is the Catholic Church we're talking about, right? The more Catholic videos that I look at, the less interested I am in anything that the Catholics have to say, because clearly they are not after the truth, just comfort and compliance. Wise Disciple, Casey Cole, and others, they're all like this, and this is just pointless. Granted, he could turn it around in the second half. I don't know. We're going to have to keep watching, as sad as that is. Maybe we can get a pool going in the comments. Will this improve, or is this just going to remain the same tired, emotionally coddling nonsense that the first half has been? I guess we're just going to have to find out next week. So put your bets in the comments, and I'll see you then. The religious love to claim that they have undeniable evidence, but the second that you look at, it's all very easily deniable. Poking holes in theist claims is simple if you have any data or knowledge at all. They don't, which is why they keep pulling this stuff. So, let's go do it all again. Won't that be fun? Here comes yet another theist who thinks they have undeniable evidence for, something. We see this all the time. This time it comes from a channel called Fearless for the Cross. And I'd change that to Brainless because it becomes painfully clear very quickly that he's just repeating comforting stories that he's heard and doesn't actually understand what's really going on. Now that's not much of a surprise, but let's get to it and see what's what.
You cannot deny this historical proof for Jesus.
Ooh, I bet I can. Granted, I'm not going to just deny it for the sake of denying it, but every single one of these claims fail because they just don't stand up to any kind of critical evaluation. This is what the theist wants to be true, but wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. They are primed to accept any claim that gets them where they want to go, which is really just confirmation bias, and we know the religious have a serious problem with that. So let's just keep that in mind as we keep going. What is your evidence for Jesus? Anybody think he's really got any? Neither do I.
Tacitus was a Roman historian who hated Christians.
Who? You mean Tacitus, right? Because this right here is evidence that this guy doesn't know what the hell he's doing. And I find that to be incredibly common among the religious. He hasn't actually studied any of this. He just heard it somewhere, assumed that it's just got to be true because it gets him where he wants to go, and then he just runs with it without doing any kind of independent research or trying to verify anything. Why? Because he doesn't care. That's the problem. He doesn't care. Most Christians don't. They're just trying to bum rush the stage so that they can proclaim, "We were right all along." But it doesn't work that way, does it? Now, I don't tend to go into a huge amount of detail around here. I say as much as is necessary to debunk the claims of the religious, but I don't take an hour to explain everything about Tacitus or whatever. I could, at least for a lot of things, but that's not really this channel's purpose. I'm here to expose stupidity, not to educate people who, let's be honest, really don't want to be educated. There are channels out there that will give you every single detail that we know about Tacitus if you're really into that kind of thing, but this isn't it, so don't expect that. But anyway, yes, Tacitus didn't like Christianity much. That's true. So what? Let's find out.
However, his writings are some of the most reliable sources we have of history from that period.
Not necessarily. Ancient historians weren't really historians as we think of them today. You're not going to find anyone prior to maybe 1500 CE, and that's kind of being charitable, that has anywhere near the same kind of reliability as a modern day historian does. Back then, history just wasn't done in the same way that we do it today. That said, Tacitus, as an example of ancient historian standards, he wasn't bad. He's probably on par with, say, the Plinies, who were also relatively well regarded. The problem with most ancient historians is that they didn't go out and try to verify things before they wrote them down. They heard stories, they wrote those stories down as they heard them. That's the way they worked. You can be relatively certain that the story was accurately written down as he heard it, but that doesn't make the story true. Now, I suppose if Tacitus was actually there, You could probably be a little bit more confident in the content, but generally speaking, he wrote what he heard, and Christians are so desperate to believe anything that gets them where they want to go that they kind of forget to ask these questions or even understand what's really going on. This is probably going to get even worse, so let's get back to the video and see.
And this man who hated Christians says in his writings that there was a person called Jesus.
He's passing on a story that he heard from early Christians. That doesn't make that story true. Tacitus, who wasn't even born until 55 or 56 CE, making him far too young to have ever seen anything for himself, and we have no indication that he went and verified these claims in any way, that doesn't mean that any of this stuff actually happened. Now, this all appears in Annals 1544, which follows a description of the Great Fire of Rome, where he mentions that Nero was trying to blame the Christians for the disaster, and he says that the leader of the Christians was Christus or Crestus. Now, we have no indication that he's doing any more than relating stories that he's heard from Christians. In fact, it really sounds like he thinks that this Christus or Crestus was the name of their leader, not a title. That's how it's presented. Therefore, it's all very questionable just how reliable Tacitus is in this situation, because clearly he hasn't done any corroboratory research. He then goes on to describe how Christians were abused and tortured. Nobody denies that Christians existed or that they were tortured by Rome, so that's really off topic for this discussion. The fact that we have no original copies of the Annals says that we can't even be sure what the original said. We know that early Christians tried to forge legitimate scholars' works in order to lend credence to their beliefs, so that's not exactly beyond the realm of possibilities. The only surviving copies of the Annals, or at least the earliest ones, are called the Medicean manuscripts, and the one that contains this passage, scholars generally agree it was written in the 11th century at a Catholic abbey, so you can take that as you will. Now, it doesn't mean that there was any hanky-panky going on, but we also can't exclude the possibility either. As with most things from the ancient world, there's a whole lot we don't know and probably never will.
And he was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate when King Tiberius was ruling. This is exactly what the Bible says. Tacitus also says that there was an explosion in the growth of Christianity.
Actually, there wasn't. Probably comparatively it was growing, but Christianity was still a really tiny cult until the time of Constantine, more than 2 centuries later. Tacitus wrote his Annals between 105 and 120 CE, so he wouldn't have known what was coming. Relative growth, sure, I can buy that. There were little churches springing up all over the place, but it was still illegal to be a Christian, and those churches existed in fear. They told stories to each other, and even way back at the time of Paul, relatively speaking, he was already warning about heretical teachings within the Christian churches. So if Tacitus was getting this story from somewhere, and you have no idea where really, you have no idea if the story that he was told was accurate or not. Of course, this guy isn't going to be asking any of these questions because that's potentially problematic to his beliefs. He just really wants this stuff to be true, and if Tacitus wasn't lending any kind of credence to what he really wanted to believe, he'd never bring it up, would he?
After this event, this man is known to have no sympathy for Christians, and even he admits the historical accuracy of the Bible.
He said nothing at all of the sort. Nowhere does Tacitus even mention the Bible, because the Bible didn't exist until hundreds of years later. Some of the books of the Bible weren't even written at this point. So he's telling tall tales that I doubt he even knows aren't true, and that's one of the major problems that we see with a lot of these self-styled apologists. They're just ignorant. They just really want it to be true. But that doesn't mean anything, does it?
Friends, Jesus definitely existed, and he gave his life for you. The question is, will you accept him into your heart? God bless you. And I'll see you.
Yeah, maybe turn down the music a little bit because nobody can even hear you at the end. That's something else that I've mentioned in the past because a lot of theists do it. Production values my ass. However, that's neither here nor there considering what he's saying, even if you can't hear it. But what he's saying is so malformed and ignorant that it's ultimately useless. Yes, someone who is not even an eyewitness to anything wrote down a story that he heard from people whose honesty is, questionable at best. And even if we want to be charitable and say that the Christians who told Tacitus the story really believed that what they were saying was true, that doesn't make it factually true, does it? So everything here is just more of the big game of telephone, just involving an outside observer who knows no more than the believers do. I get that it makes this young idiot happy, but that doesn't mean that the scholarship supports what he wishes was the case. What you want doesn't matter. What you can demonstrate does, and you notice that none of these people ever try to demonstrate anything at all, right? They don't care about the truth. They just really want to believe, and that is never, ever, ever going to be enough. It's clear, the more videos that we look at, that Christians have no minds, at least not when it comes to their religion. And that goes for all other religions too, but mostly it's Christians that have the most absurd arguments and incredulous claims, and they can't even see the stupidity that they spout because they don't wanna. So let's look at that some more coming up next, because that sounds fun, right? This one comes from Casby Bartley, called Mind-Blowing Proof for God, Part 1. Okay, I'm game. Of course, I don't think we're going to be impressed because, as always, none of this is being made with skeptics in mind. It's just for those who already believe because they're desperate to get to their imaginary sky daddy. But I guess we'll take a look anyhow, because it might be good for a laugh.
This is mind-blowing proof that God is real, Part 1.
I have no idea if it's going to be worth looking at Part 2. I guess we'll have to see after the end. This time, I'm delving into some religious TikTok videos, which I generally don't do because I think TikTok is a complete waste of time. But hey, might as well expand our horizons, right? I wish I could believe that TikTok theists were going to be any smarter than YouTube theists, which I think we all know isn't going to be the case. Where are the smart theists? Somebody, if you think you know, drop a hit in the comments below, and let's get to it.
I don't know how anyone could not believe in God after watching this.
Okay, that's quite a build-up, but we've heard it all before. I don't know how anybody wouldn't believe in my God. I mean, look at the trees. The religious are far too easily impressed and lack the critical thinking skills to really evaluate these claims on their actual merits instead of on blind faith and fee-fees. So let's expect that to happen, although I'm happy to be proven wrong. Although, now that I think about it, if this is so convincing, why does he need a part 2? This should be a one and done, right? That goes for all apologists. If your best argument can't convince people, then it's not that good, is it? And if it is that good, then why don't you retire? I mean, you've done your job under the Great Commission, right? Everybody ought to believe now. So go take a break.
Now the Bible says that the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life.
So your absolutely convincing argument is my book said a thing. Seriously? Granted, that's all any of them can really do, and as I've said, they're not making this for us. We don't care about your big book of make-believe, at least until you can prove, with objective evidence, that every single word of it is true, and as we all know, they're not even trying. They're not even giving it a good faith effort. Faith and fifis don't get you anywhere, but they're not looking for skeptics to believe, only other dumb people like themselves. Gullible people. People who don't much care about the truth, so long as they can get that dopamine shot in the head. So we have to go into these videos understanding that they're not going to be convincing. At least, I've never seen one that was, and I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these stupid things. Maybe this will be different, though. I don't know. It's not starting off intelligent, but hey, let's stick around and see.
So this means the human body was made from the ground. Now, it wasn't found until thousands of years later, but the same 17 elements that make up dirt is the same 17 elements that make up the human body.
Not really. Now, the simple answer is that everything is made of the same stuff, generally speaking. There are 6 elements that make up most of the human body, those being oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. That's 99% of everything you're comprised of. The rest is generally potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium, along with some other stuff that's not required for life, just byproducts of biology, and the things that we eat that are discarded. Why? Because we are literally what we eat. Everything is. Earth is just decayed other stuff. You can really say that dirt is, in large part, made of us. Us and other things that have died, decayed, and been recycled into other things. So, I guess this guy is sort of right, entirely accidentally, but he's going to come to a very wrong conclusion, just like most theists do. So, let's go look at him fail.
Now, there's no way that the author could have known this.
It was an incredibly common theological belief back in the day. Virtually all religions said the same thing. I guess all of their gods were real too, right? The ancient Hebrews didn't come up with it on their own, or really, they didn't come up with anything on their own. They just copied from the pre-existing cultures around them who did the same thing back into time immemorial. This guy's problem is that he doesn't actually understand reality. He's just going on what he's been raised to believe and told from the pulpit, and when he stumbles across something in the outside world that he can twist into working with his faith, kinda, he assumes that he's just justified his belief. He hasn't, but these people aren't that bright, are they?
Without God being real, this just proves that the Bible is the written word of God.
It does nothing remotely of the sort. This is leaping to conclusions not justified by your evidence. He just really wants it to be true. If he was at all familiar with other ancient cultures in the Middle East, he wouldn't be saying this, but he's not. So not only is he gullible, he's ignorant, and that's not really a good combination to have. Granted, the religious, they don't tend to give a damn because they're just desperate to get to their blind faith and wishes and dreams, while the rest of us are just laughing our asses off at their stupidity. Because it always comes down to that, doesn't it? I wonder why.
And we're not going to stop there. I got more. Now, the Bible says that God put Adam into a deep sleep and actually took the rib from man and created woman.
Well, not really. The words used specifically say side, not rib. So, according to the story, God took a huge chunk out of Adam and made Eve out of it. So let's go back and look at some earlier verses in Genesis 2, which is the earliest of the 2 creation stories in the Bible. In it, God made Adam first, then made all the animals, and hoped that one would become a good partner for Adam. You know, Adam was supposed to go fuck a cow or something. When no suitable helper was found, as you can see on screen, God ripped Adam apart like a slasher villain and then made someone else out of his side. Of course, none of this ever actually happened in reality. Not that you could get this dumbass to admit it, because the whole creation story, both of them, they're just a myth. Two myths, really, since it was two entirely different stories that were sort of stitched together hundreds of years later, and now Christians have to try to rationalize this mishmash together because they can't admit that it's actually two stories. So this is our second "my book says a thing" that means absolutely nothing without corroboratory evidence that any of it is actually true. And I hope you won't mind that I'm not impressed with any of it, because I'm not.
Now listen to this. It wasn't discovered till thousands of years later, but the rib is the only bone in the body that can actually be taken out and regenerate on its own.
Which is why I said that the Bible doesn't say rib. I had no idea this is where he was going, but accuracy and translation matters, and modern Bibles, written by believers, are not particularly accurate in a lot of ways. Interestingly, he didn't read the title of his article, which says that the same could be true for our entire skeleton. So ribs are not, or at least might not be, the only bone of which that's true. A little honesty, if you please, because this isn't anything that hasn't been known forever. Because we all know bones regenerate. If you break a bone, it heals. In fact, bones are under constant attack by our own daily activities. They suffer microscopic damage constantly, which heals just fine. So I'm not sure what he's really going on about, since everything he said is just wrong. Not that it's any real surprise or anything, because these people are just dumb.
Once again, it would be impossible for the author to know this unless he was divinely inspired and proving that God is real.
Or he just observed the real world around him, because people break bones all the time and they heal. So he's taking a mistranslation created specifically for theological reasons and not understanding the actual text, then assuming people are just as stupid as he is, because he's clearly not observant or capable of thinking intelligently about anything. And then coming to, God done it, y'all. What is wrong with this guy? Let me know down in the comments, because I really don't get how dumb these people actually are.
And the Bible is the written word of God.
Going for the irrationality long jump there, huh? Not that we should be at all surprised, because they all do this, don't they? They are so desperate to get back to Happy Land that they overlook the reality that surrounds them. None of this is at all defensible, which he would know if he'd bother to do any background research, which clearly he hasn't. It's like he thinks he can just fast talk his way to his religion, which is mostly all the religious ever do. They can't stop and do the actual research required to justify that any of this makes any sense whatsoever. Because I can offer other explanations, even if, for the sake of argument, we let everything else go past. Let's assume that everything that he said is correct, even though that's anything but. That doesn't mean that God done it. Maybe Satan influenced the Bible. Maybe it was evil space aliens. You can't rule those out just because you don't like the idea. Yet that's exactly how the religious operate, because none of this has anything at all to do with the truth, only emotional comfort. And that makes them dumb and irrational, and we see that from them all the time. It doesn't matter what you really wish was true, only what actually is, and they have no interest whatsoever in determining which is which. They don't care. They just really want to believe. So let me know down in the comments if you think I should go looking for part 2, or if this was enough dumb from this guy for a lifetime. Because either way, I'm willing to give it a shot if you want me to, so let me know your thoughts. My book says a thing is one of the dumbest things that the religious keep saying, and most of the time I think it's the winner by a mile in a field of really dumb stuff. Why do they do it though? Because they don't care. They're not bright enough to know any better, and this is going to prove that once again conclusively. So strap in tight, because this is going to be intensely stupid. Here we go with a short video from a messenger of truth. And sadly, this guy clearly wouldn't know what the truth was if it bit him in the ass. Because these people don't actually care about truth. They only care about conning the gullible and proclaiming victory without ever having competed in the race. And yes, this is another video where the entire comment section is just ripping this moron a new one, and he's just ignoring it all. Because he doesn't care one bit, does he? Nowhere that I can see did he respond to anyone. And that's not exactly a surprise, is it? So let's get to it.
I don't like having a conversation with someone where they try to prove the existence of God with the Bible.
It's also useless because my book says a thing doesn't mean anything. And I mean that for any book and any subject, not just the Bible. You can't use a physics book to prove physics either. Ultimately, it comes down to the evidence. The book can point you to the evidence, it can detail the evidence, but the evidence is really all that matters. The book is only a convenient package. The problem here is that the Bible, and let's be honest, any other religious book you can name, has no external demonstrable evidence to back it up. It's all claims, no facts involved. And it's the facts that matter. The claims are completely useless. The claims mean nothing unless you can independently support them with something demonstrable. And for religion, that simply doesn't exist. Now we have to get back to the theist and see how he responds, because I figure he isn't going to like that. So let's see what this guy has to say.
So I already proved him wrong in this video on YouTube. Yes, you can prove God's existence using the Bible.
No, you can't unless you just assume that the Bible is true, and we have no reason whatsoever to do that. This is why it all comes down to faith. Granted, I haven't seen the other video, so I don't know what he said, and I've got no real interest in going down that particular rabbit hole either, but it doesn't matter what any book says if you cannot corroborate the book with demonstrable evidence. And you can't. So is he going to give us a quick proof here that he has anything of substance to say, or is it just going to be faith and bald assertion? I know what I think is going to happen, but how about you? Let me know down in the comments, and let's get back to it.
I do it all the time in my videos, but this doesn't mean that atheists are persuaded by my proof.
Because your proof is bullshit. It's just claims. And I can say that confidently without ever having seen your supposed proof, because that's how every single theist on the planet works. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It doesn't matter how your beliefs make you feel. It matters what you can independently corroborate is true with supporting facts to back it up, and we all know that you've got nothing. Just because you really like your book doesn't make your book true. Just because people tell you that your book is true, that doesn't make your book true. You are not part of this equation. The truth is beyond how you feel about things. This is something that a lot of people just can't figure out. Your beliefs mean nothing to anybody else. Your feelings mean nothing to anybody else. Your faith means nothing to anybody else. You have to show how you know the things that you pretend to know, and if you can't trot the evidence out for all the world to see, then your claims are completely meaningless. And I know these people don't care, but that's the truth. Fuck you and fuck your book. Give us something to objectively examine, otherwise you're just wasting our time.
You just need to understand the difference between proof and persuasion.
So, you don't care about the truth. Well, that wasn't hard to predict. This is really how religion runs. If you can just lie to someone so they sit in the pews and hand over their money, that's a victory in the eyes of the religious. But in all honesty, it's just a scam. The only thing that I care about is the demonstrable truth, backed up with objectively verifiable evidence, and the religious, they have none of that, do they? Never have, and so far as we can tell, never will. They're not even trying, which is something that I've said 1,000 times before. If they actually cared about the truth, they would be out there looking for corroboratory evidence. They wouldn't just be preaching fee-fees and faith, they would be funding archaeological digs. Actual digs, I mean, not the farcical faith fests that they tend to go after. Actual truth seekers wouldn't value the ridiculous opinions of a fraud like Ron Wyatt. But that's not what they do, because that's not who they are. They are only looking for confirmation of the things they already believe on faith by people who also already take it on faith, so that the money keeps flowing and they can live in the manner that they'd like to become accustomed to. They don't care about the truth at all, which is why they're all such ridiculous laughingstocks. Because they simply are.
You see, Jesus can prove to the atheist that God exists and that he exists all day long.
Really? And when do you think that's going to happen? Because Jesus hasn't convinced me of squat. You've got no reason to think that Jesus ever existed at all in any demonstrable way. The religious tend to think that because they believe it, that everyone else has to believe it too, and that is not how this works. My standards are a lot higher than yours, and I don't require a different set of rules for one belief system over another. Mine are all the same, and you can't get anywhere remotely close to meeting my standards with your stupid faith. I don't want any particular thing to be true or to be false. I just want to know what is true and be able to demonstrate that it actually is. And the religious just don't care because, they're all kind of dumb.
But if they don't want the proof, if they're not persuaded, that's not the fault of the argument. That's the fault of the unbeliever. They need to repent and believe the gospel.
And why would they do that if you haven't shown them that the gospel is true in the first place? Because I could say the exact same thing from any other perspective. It's not my fault that you don't believe in invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. You have to just repent and just believe. In fact, every single other religion out there can and does say the same thing. You just have to believe. Why? Because you do. But that doesn't make it true. You haven't justified anything. But I'm still right, and you have to have faith. This is why these idiots fail, because they are nowhere remotely within spitting distance of demonstrable actual reality. Just because you really like the belief doesn't make that belief true. Just because you are really convinced that it is, that doesn't mean that it is. And every single religious group out there does the exact same thing, and none of it is convincing to any of the skeptics, which is why they don't want to talk to the skeptics. They know that they've got nothing that's going to convince us, but they don't care about convincing the non-believers, do they? At least, unless those people are really, really, really easy to con. Their job is just to pander to the already faithful so that they keep giving them their money. And who doesn't understand this? Beyond the dumb theists, I mean. But this is still what's going on. Because they're all dumb. And that is not a good thing. We keep asking the religious for evidence, and they never have any, do they? All they have are empty claims and a whole lot of excuses, and that is not enough. Yet they can't get that simple fact through their heads, can they? So let's examine that today, coming up next. Mike Winger is one of the biggest idiots out there, and this is going to show why. Of course, he doesn't care because this is all about faith and fifis and never about facts and evidence. He's just pandering to an already religious audience because they don't care either. Maybe it's time they started caring, but if they did that, they'd have to give up their silly beliefs and join reality like the rest of us. So why don't we see the evidence for his imaginary friend? Let's let Mike explain.
There's this divide that it maybe is best explained by the analogy of eyes being open or closed. When you close your eyes, there's nothing in the room.
Except there is. Try closing your eyes and walking around sometime. You're going to fall over stuff. The stuff is there even if you can't see it, which is why for blind people, they still have to contend with stuff. That's why they carry canes or have guide dogs, because the stuff is there whether they can see it or not. Reality doesn't go away just because you stop looking at it, which is why his entire analogy fails. This is supposed to be about why you don't see any evidence for God, but it's because there's no actual evidence to see. If we close our eyes, we use some other sense to detect what's actually going on. So tell us what sense we ought to be using, real sense I mean, not magical thinking or faith, to get to actual demonstrable defensible evidence for any God. And he won't be able to do that because he's just desperately rationalizing his way back to his faith. Yeah, fuck you, Mike. You can't be this dumb.
And as long as you keep your eyes closed, I could say to you, prove to me that there's a painting in the room. I'm going to keep my eyes closed.
Easy. Walk over there and touch it. There you go. Because this is the same argument that I've seen solipsists make. Well, you can't prove to me that the real world exists. Fine. Come over here and I will beat you over the head with a baseball bat until you either admit the real world is there or you pass out from blunt force trauma. Whether you like it or not, the real world is there. That's what all the evidence that we have says. You can deny it all you want, but then you're just being an idiot. I can prove the painting exists. I'll take it off the wall and break it over your head. Deny that. So now that we've established that reality exists, go ahead and do the same thing with your God. That's what we're asking for, and all Mike is doing is arguing that we're not looking hard enough. There's nothing to see. If you think there is, point it out for us in some way that is testable and objectively verifiable. I mean, do something. Holy shit, Mike is a moron.
It's going to be harder to prove that. Or I open my eyes, in which case I'm not even asking.
But we are asking. See, we're asking for things that you can't provide, and you know that you can't provide it. That's why you're making excuses for why this evidence, in big air quotes, can't be seen. But it's still there because the idea that it's there makes you emotionally comforted. So what? When we say, show us the evidence, you need to show us the evidence. But you're so busy running around with the goalposts that you're just embarrassing yourself. You have no evidence. You have only faith in fifis, and that is simply not enough. Go fuck yourself, Mike. You're an idiot.
And this is what often happens, I think, with skeptics. There's so much taken for granted as they begin their study for God.
Like what? Because we're just listening to your claims. You say that this God of yours exists and interacts with our reality in some way. In fact, most of you claim that this God thing of yours created our reality. Great. Now back that up with something other than your say-so, because that is simply not enough. It is never going to be enough. We have never seen anything real that isn't objectively defensible. Therefore, at least until you can show us how you've come to these conclusions rationally, I don't care. Otherwise, we're not going to believe you until you can come up with the evidence that we can study for ourselves that we don't have to have faith in. Everything else in reality works that way, except your God, which works an entirely different way, and we have no way to show that anything that you're saying is actually true. but you just want us to take your word for it, and we're not going to do that. This is a massive case of special pleading. No, just no.
They begin looking for God, right? They look around at the universe. They look around at creation. They look around at their own life. They feel their own soul, their own being.
This is just you projecting. I don't see any of that. I mean, the soul and stuff like that. That's something that you're trying to put on us that isn't demonstrably real. Of course, I look around the universe because you say that this God interacts with the universe, but you can't show us how that God interacts with the universe. You can't show us anywhere that this God has demonstrably interacted with the universe. Where else would you expect us to go to find such evidence except in reality? Everything else that interacts with the universe leaves evidence behind. Where's yours? Oh, they don't have any, so they just have to make something up. Well, it's in your head. So it's just delusion then. That's what you're saying. Because I'll tell you right now that what you're claiming is in my head isn't. It's not there. And then they try to argue with you. Well, yes, it is. Everybody knows there's a God. No, it's not. You don't get to tell me what I think. You don't get to just assert your way to victory. You have to show me that what you're saying is demonstrably true, and you're not even trying to do that. Stop making a fool of yourself. It's all you're doing.
They see beauty, morality, and goodness, and that's all just there without explanation for them.
We have explanations. They just don't include your imaginary friend. That's what all of this ultimately is. It's just assertion. Well, it seems to me. Yeah, who cares? We're trying to verify the things that you're saying are actually true in objective reality. You want nothing at all to do with that. That's why you rely on faith, and faith is meaningless. Then you complain that we're not coddling your fifis because what you want to be true is just nonsense. It's completely indefensible. You're just a moron. Stop it. Seek help.
And then they turn to you and say, okay, now prove there's a God.
Yeah, go ahead. Because you haven't justified your bald-assed assertions in any way. We don't care what you believe. We care what you can prove independent of your faith, your fifis, what's in your head, etc. We want to know what's really going on, not what makes you feel good. This is just Mike Winger making a complete fool of himself, which is hardly a surprise because that's all he ever manages to do. This is just, don't you trust me? No. Why should I? What have you done to earn that trust? I personally think you're a dick. I think you've got problems upstairs. I think you're out of your ever-loving mind. Now, demonstrate to me that you know what you're talking about with demonstrable evidence. Not claims, not faith, not, I really want it to be true. Evidence. Things that I don't have to take your word for. Things I don't have to take anybody's word for. Stuff that I can examine on my own. Go ahead and do that. Of course, he never ever will.
And you're like, you're sort of starting from a place where you have missed all the evidence.
No, we've just ignored your empty assertions and wishful thinking because it doesn't mean anything. Because here's the thing that we all need to remember. Mike doesn't matter. Christians don't matter. People don't matter. A thing is real or not real entirely on its own. What you believe doesn't matter. If a God exists, any God, then it exists whether anyone believes in it or not. We want the evidence that it exists, not what you claim about it. We don't care about your claims, we care about your facts, and sadly you don't seem to have any. Because again, nothing else in reality works that way. I don't have to take your word for it for anything else. And I'm not going to take your word for it with a God. That's what you expect because that's what works on stupid people like Mike. But it's not going to work on us. Do better. It's kind of hard to do worse because Mike is an idiot. So anyway, that was it. What did you think? Mike continues to be one of the worst apologists out there, and that's kind of saying a bunch, isn't it? He doesn't understand what he's doing wrong because he doesn't care. He's just looking for other gullible, stupid people who will buy into his claims uncritically, and that's not us. This is why the religious make such ludicrous fools of themselves, because they are ludicrous fools. They like to pretend that we're the problem, but we're not. They are. They are the ones who approach these beliefs completely uncritically and irrationally. They're the ones who just want to believe. They're the idiots here, not us. We're just pointing out all the stupid stuff they're doing wrong. And sadly, I don't think they'll ever learn.